afternoon, everybody. This is Rich Walter. I'm the Vice President of Curriculum and Outreach for Center for Israel Education. I want to welcome you to our webinar with Professor Ken Stein this afternoon. Before we get started, I just wanted to begin by sharing with you the resource that really is at the foundation of all of the work that we do, and that is our Center for Israel Education website, which you can find at www.israeled.org. And it's a wonderful resource that everyone who's on the call should be well aware of. And without further ado, I now want to turn it over to Professor Ken Stein for Israel at 70 Unfinished.
Good afternoon. This is Ken Stein. Welcome to our webinar on Israel at 70 Unfinished. We're delighted to bring this to you just several days before the anniversary of Israel's Declaration of Independence in May of 1948. We are delighted that you can be here, and we're glad that this is an opportunity for you to learn with us as we move forward. So let's get started. The purpose of the webinar is to suggest to you that there are opportunities for us to compare Israel at 70 with other opportunities, such as comparison with the United States when it was at 70 years old. The question is, can we actually ask the question, is Israel unfinished? And if it's unfinished in terms of its relationships with whom and with what. If Israel is only 70 years old, is it even fair for us to ask the question? As we get started, I'd like to have us take a look at how Israelis see themselves at 70. Take a look at how American and Israelis have a self-view of one another. Then take a look at the context of Zionism, Zionism's goals and successes, and then move from there into Israel's objectives. It's important to see from the outset that I have taken almost for granted that Zionism flows into Israel, that Israel is a continuity of Jewish history and Zionism is part of Jewish history. I don't take the view that Israel is somehow some unnatural interjection into Jewish history, but in fact is a natural accretion to the development of Jewish history. And in doing so, I will make some judgments about Zionism's goals, objectives, successes, its means for creating those successes, and then move into what Israel's objectives are. And then we'll be a little bit more direct in asking the question, is Israel unfinished? Or is it in fact fair to ask the question that Israel is unfinished? And when we ask unfinished, what is unfinished? We're asking the question here in the United States. We're asking the question here in the diaspora. We're asking the question because we have certain beliefs and expectations about what the state should be. We're not really asking the question of did Zionism succeed, although we can raise some questions there as well, but we're trying to apply certain criteria because of our expectations about the successes, the failures, and the ongoing nature of Israel. And the standards that we're using to measure. Are we measuring Israel by our standards that we've developed here in the United States? our standards about relationships between people, our standards about peace and security, our standards about religion and state. I would argue that sometimes what we do is we take our own values, where they're cultivated here in the United States or in Argentina or in Mexico or South Africa, and we tend to apply those standards to a very different part of the world, namely Israel. And so I asked the question, what would Americans ask on July 4th at 242 years old, is America finished? We're not asking that question on July 15th, 2018. But we are asking the question here today, 70 years after Israel's creation. And would Israelis have a webinar today or this week on Is Israel Unfinished? I think we probably have a greater tendency to do that here in the United States because we are uncertain about how Israel has completed or not completed the tasks which we feel should be finished and done, or we don't like the way that they may have completed those tasks to this date. What pushed the 13 colonies to demand independence back in 1776? Or asked differently, what pushed the Zionists in the 1880s to seek a state of their own? Or what pushed those who established the state of Israel after Zionism to continue? There was no force of law that forced them to do so, but they did so because it was their goal to create a sovereign Jewish state. So let's take a look at Israel's self-views for April of 2018. And this material is taken from the April 2018 Israel Democracy Index. And some 91% of Israelis are proud to be Israelis. They're satisfied with Israel's balance of achievements. 76% would keep living in Israel even if they had a choice to live in another country. 75% optimistic about their future. Optimism or pessimism regarding the country's future? Well, on the right, there's a clear majority. Optimists in the center, 65.8. And on the left, there's a minority of optimists, albeit a large one, 46%. So we could see that the way you tend to look at your politics also has an influence about whether you're optimistic about the country's future if you're living in the state of Israel. And in the Israeli Arab public, picture's a little different. The majority say they would stay in Israel if they could move elsewhere. A small majority said they are not satisfied with the balance of the country's achievements and failures. And 33%, they did say they're still proud to be Israeli. So that means 66% or 66% either didn't respond or said no, but still 33% of a minority in a state of Israel, the Arab minority, seems to be reasonably optimistic and willing to stay in the country for a prolonged period of time. What's the most important for ensuring Israel's future? And this was, again, an IDI peace index from October 9, 2017. And this is a very interesting finding. And if you'll read along with me, the highest rate put reducing the tensions in Israeli society as first place. The second was the improvement of education. At the bottom of the ladder was the peace settlement with the Palestinians. And the third was enhancing the bond between the leaders and the people. Now, if you ask that same set of questions of Americans, you would probably find many of these answers quite different. According to a Pew study, and again, according to the Israel Democracy Institute's Peace Index, 38% of Israelis and 66% of American Jews put security as Israel's highest priority. So almost twice as many Americans put Israel's security is the highest priority, while 39% of Israelis and only 1% of Americans say economic issues are most important. So again, if we're judging is Israel unfinished, we are judging it by a population, we are ourselves judging it as a population that's a little bit different than the population that lives in Israel. At the top of their list of personal priorities, 26.5% noted that reducing tensions in Israeli society, followed by 22% in bettering the education system, and again, 11% for a solution with the Palestinians. Among Israeli Jews, 42% say the settlements help Israel's security. I'll let you digest that for a moment. And only 17% of American Jews believe this is the case. So the view of settlements, which may be very contentious within the American Jewish community, or with elements of the American Jewish community, many Israelis believe that the settlements offer them something a lot different than Americans would even consider. So if we take a look at Israel, and we say to ourselves, do we have the patience to allow Israel to move forward, or do we want to be impatient? When the US began in 1776, did it really start in 1620? In other words, was there really 150 years in advance? Well, you could argue maybe there was 150 years in advance of 1948. If we go back to the middle of the 1800s as far as Zionism is concerned. That's not necessarily a magic rule of thumb when it comes to time of having an idea and then turning the idea into a state. And I arbitrarily picked 1620 because of Plymouth Rock. But 70 years later, can we claim that the United States was finished? Can we claim that in 1846, before our Civil War, before we went through the Progressive Era, before we had the additions to our Constitution that gave women the right to vote. So that in terms of what Israel has accomplished in its 70 years, certainly a very different century than America was when it was 70 years old. But the accomplishments and the sophistication seem to be pretty well along their way. Maybe not completed, but certainly on their way. I would argue that Israel didn't begin in 48. I would argue that Israel began much, much earlier. And I don't subscribe to the notion that it was the events of 39 to 45 that established the state of Israel. May have catalyzed it forward, but it was some diligence and perseverance and some good planning and some luck that enabled a small group of people to establish a state and go from 60,000 in 1917, or if you want to go even further back, 24,000 in 1882 in terms of the total numbers in Palestine, 24,000 in 1882, and go all the way down to 1948 when there were 660,000. So for that, I'm going to ask you to take a moment with me and take a look at the Zionist-Israeli context. The Zionism ingredients, and I do this because I think far too often we're telling Israel's history based only on 39 to 45 or what happened between 47 and 49, and then we move forward. Rather than digging deep into the identity of the Zionists who actually went ahead and formed the state. And their origins come out of a long tradition of being attached to ideas and customs and rules and regulations and wanderings and turning into peoplehood And then from that, anti-Semitism layers some cement over it, and then it gets to be really virulent. And then from that, there's an effort of trying to emancipate yourself in Europe, and that doesn't seem to work. And getting out of the ghetto in the 17th and 18th centuries, moving from rural to urban areas, the timing and the opportunity enabled Jews to decide what it is they were going to do with their future. How are they going to change it? And they articulated an objective, and the chance was to choose. And they adopted certain methods on how to on what to choose and what the ultimate goal is. And I think the ultimate goal was expressed in the Hatikva, what later on became Israel's national anthem, and the key phrase, "Liot am chofshi ba'artzeno," to be a free nation in our land. And that is essentially what the core of the struggle for Zionism was all about, to be a free people. And also it became the basis or the foundation stone for, obviously, the state of Israel as well. So here are the options that were available to Jews. And let's not forget that Zionism was only one of very few choices available that were on the Zionist agenda, or on the Jewish agenda, not the Zionist agenda, in the middle of the 1800s. And the decision was made to, amongst many, to travel, to move. Between the 1860s and the 1920s, 2.5 to 3 million Jews immigrated. They immigrated somewhere, and they chose, a very small minority of them chose Eretz Yisrael. And what were those objectives? And here I'm listing those objectives from hindsight, because historians have given that to us, but it was also stated by the Zionists at the moment that these were our goals. This is what we tried to do. This is what we wanted to accomplish. And these were not objectives that were necessarily thought out initially by everyone, but they evolved along the way. There was a certain dynamism to Zionism. I'm reminded of Shlomo Avineri's excellent article in the now defunct Jerusalem Quarterly, when he argues that Zionism was a Jewish national liberation movement. And I use the baseball term or concept was to link people to the land, to build institutions. And it was to control your destiny. And the key here was get them on, get them over, and get them in. Get them to first, get them to second, get them to third. Sacrifice, perseverance was the means, was the method, and not always successful. And certainly not, there wasn't a run to make Zionism work. It was a small minority of people, some people who really didn't like what happened when they got to Palestine in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. Some people turned around and went home. This was not the land of milk and honey that they may have dreamed of. But there were some Zionism successes. And in that success of building a place for themselves, they learned to acquire and use political power. They had to acquire and learn physical power. They had to go from powerlessness to power because of the realities of the moment, because they were thrust into the Middle East voluntarily, but they were thrust into burgeoning conflicts or confrontations or joustings or civil disorder with the local Arab population. And the local Arab population was not keen to have the Zionists come. And there were sporadic periods of violence. But they managed to create a sovereign Jewish state. They did it through their organization. They did it through permission granted to them by the British in the 2 decades after World War I. They linked the people to the land. They were able to gain international legitimacy, and they were able to sustain the relationship with the diaspora in doing so. I'm going to go back to it, but I'd like to raise it now, and that is the whole interaction between the Zionists and the local Arab population. I spent a lifetime studying it, wrote a book on the land question in Palestine way back when I was a young academic some 35 years ago, and tried to take a look at how Zionists interacted with the Arab population and how the Arab population interacted with the Zionists. And I haven't really changed my view that the Zionists had difficulty creating a nucleus for a Jewish state, but they did it. And Arab residents in Palestine, not this total myth that it was only Arabs who sold land to the Jews who were outside of Palestine. There were Palestinian Arabs, we have the land records to prove it, who were willing to part with a certain portion of their patrimony, stayed vehement and vigorous Palestinian Arab nationalists, but still enabled and helped the Zionists gain a foothold. They succeeded because they had lobbied for the cause. They obtained international sanction. They took challenges which they had to meet, weren't easy ones: immigration restrictions, lack of money, lack of commitment on some Jews to even want to immigrate. 1927-28 was not a great year for Jewish immigration. And the local Arab population was dysfunctional, and they just made bad decisions. Had there been a more unified Palestinian Arab opposition, I'm not sure the Zionists would have succeeded. And there's an array of Palestinian Arabs or Arabs who wrote in the period immediately after the 1948 war. And you can see it on the website under our theme, 1948 War. You can just go off to the right-hand side and read 4 or 5 paragraphs of some of the most esteemed Palestinian writers on their own analysis of what happened in 47 to 49. I'm not here assigning blame. What I'm here is assigning history. This is how historians have viewed it themselves. You can take it from there on what you think is most important and most relevant. The surrounding Arab states, as we learned, were most jealous of one another. Some of them aided the Zionists, mostly because of their division. And ultimately, the British and the US lost interest once they couldn't regain Palestine after the partition vote in 1947. So I think, in a certain sense, the Zionists succeeded. They succeeded with difficulty, they succeeded with mistakes, but they persevered, they went on through. And I'm not going to spend time here talking about opportunities lost in negotiations in the end of the 1940s with the Syrians or with Abdullah. What could have happened, what should have happened, that's all been pretty well trod over by very excellent historians. What were the 9 objectives of Israel that evolved over time? Now we've come to a break, I think, in the evaluation of Israel Unfinished. If we say that the foundation for the state of Israel was completed relatively successfully in 50 years after Herzl, we'd have to nod and say, yeah, I guess it was. Was it young? Was it new? Was it sputtering along? Did it have enough money? Was it prepared to absorb hundreds of thousands of more immigrants? No. Did it? It did. It took challenges and it turned them into opportunities. But the goal of the state of Israel, once it was established, were ninefold. There may be more, and you may come up with many more than I'm proposing here. They wanted to maintain a Jewish character and a Jewish minority in the state. The key, liot am chofshi ba'artzenu, to be a free people on our land, to exercise control over their own destiny, over their own sovereignty. Parenthetically, right now I'm in the midst of reading a whole slew of documents from the archives on what happened at Camp David in September of 1978, and what was the dialogue that went on between the Israeli delegation and the American delegation. And the constant refrain from Dayan and Weitzman and Rosen and Barak and Begin was, you can't tell us what it is we want to do. You know, you can't bring up the whole issue of Jerusalem the last couple of days of this conference or meeting simply because it's on your agenda, Mr. President. And the Israelis stuck to this notion of we have to control our own destiny. And they did it in the process of negotiation in '78. And the controlling of their own destiny is precisely why they preemptively struck in June of 1967, or they hit the Iraqi reactor in 1981, or they hit the Syrian nuclear facility in 2007. Who knows what's going to happen this week, next week, what happens with Iran. Israelis are still pursuing this policy of keeping control of their own destiny, listening to what others suggest. I think the Prime Minister of Israel is off tomorrow on Wednesday the 9th. He's off to see President Putin. And there's always the effort to keep in contact with the Europeans and the United States, to listen to what others have to say. But I think what the Israelis have come to conclusion is they'll keep destiny into their own hands. Maybe they'll make mistakes. Maybe they see withdrawing from Gaza as a preemptive move that wasn't the best idea in the world, but they did it. I think another objective of the state of Israel was to preserve the citizen security, ensure economic strength, and where possible, protect your democratic ideals and provide for Jews in need. Protecting democratic ideals in a modern state is really difficult, but they seem to be able to continue to do it with constant tensions that exist between the legislative branch and the Supreme Court, and within the legislative branch. And between the legislative branch, the Supreme Court, the general public, and the media. There seems to be this constant churning that goes on how do you protect individual rights, individual freedoms in a democratic society. But that essentially means that struggle or those questions are not complete, they're not finished. And the strong bonds between Israel and diaspora Jewry remains terribly important. David Ben-Gurion gave a speech in 1958 in which he said two critical issues, maybe three critical issues are important to us. One is the law of return. The second is that we educate our own in an Israeli identity to know who we are. And really the only ally that we can trust is diaspora Jewry. And we all know that there is tension and contentiousness at times between Israel and diaspora Jewry, but they still remain to be the objectives of the state. So what are the enduring conclusions of Israel's Zionism impact? It transformed Jewish history and identity. Jews discover power and they use it, and they change the face of who they are. I think it's fair to say that Zionism in Israel delayed Jewish assimilation. For many Jews, Israel became a religion, one that you wanted to be part of your bones as much as you wanted to listen to the Torah reading on Saturday, not necessarily one or the other, but promoting a safe and secure Israel was terribly important, and that delayed assimilation. And I would certainly agree that it is polarized and splintered the Jewish world, and yet it has also kept the Jewish world constantly discussing, constantly talking. It certainly altered Middle Eastern history. Has it changed Jewish religious practice? In the United States, maybe the very fact that Israel exists has strengthened the adherence of individuals to go down that line of religious orthodoxy. Has it made Jews in the United States more conscious of being kosher or conscious of maintaining the Sabbath laws? Probably not. And it evolved an ongoing strategic defense concept of never again. And we also have to ask the question, not only how is Israel unfinished, but is Israel unfinished in terms of the impact it's had on changing and affecting diaspora Jewry, American Jewry, European, South American, Australian, South African Jewry. At this point, with about 20 minutes to go, maybe a little bit less, I'm going to ask you to chat down or write down any questions which you may have for my colleague, Rich Walter.
Yeah, what I think would be great, everyone, is
as we move forward toward the end of the webinar. He'll collect them. I'll get them just a room away from him, and maybe we can try and address some of them if you wish. Not mandatory, of course, but we'd certainly love to see if you have any questions.
So just to follow up.
Unfinished relationships. I think it's fair to say that Zionism and Israel in their evolution, the one word that appears more than any other is the word relationship. How have relationships changed, either between individuals or between concepts? What is the changed nature of religion and state in the state of Israel? We know there's controversy about access to the wall. We know that there's controversy about the rabbinate in Israel wanting to influence more than diaspora Jewry would like Jewish behavior in the diaspora, whether it's the definition of a Jew, whether it's how Jewish behavior should be processed in civil procedure. I think it's fair to say that those relationships remain unanswered. I think we have to be prepared that those are the kinds of questions that we came to a webinar at Israel at 75 or at Israel at 80, we would probably have to argue that it remains unfinished. Borders. Israel has not come to a conclusion of what its borders are. Doing a comparison of the American Constitution and the Israeli Declaration of Independence, Israel doesn't have a constitution. It drafted one, but it wasn't passed in 4950. Neither of these two major documents even raises the term borders. And both, I think, because the respective founders of the respective countries wanted to keep open the prospects of what the borders might be, or didn't want to be constrained by what the borders were at the particular moment when their respective declarations were issued. It's also a fascinating exercise to compare the American Declaration of Independence with the Israeli Declaration of Independence. Some fascinating similarities and differences. Unfinished reality is who is a Jew? How is one defined? If you serve in the Israeli army, but you don't have the right Jewish pedigree as defined by the rabbinate in Israel, are you permitted or allowed to be buried in a army cemetery. This is not an issue which I invented. These are real live cases of, what's the definition? And for some people who may be converted outside who are converted outside of Israel, it really gets down to a question of who converted you, and is it a good enough or legitimate enough conversion to be accepted? So there's a lot of tension that exists in this unfinished relationship, and there is the tension, of course, that exists between a significant portion of the Israeli population, Israeli citizenry, 20 to 25% that is Israeli Arab or Arab Palestinian, whatever the term you want to use. And it's about the same percentage that was in the state of Israel when Israel was created, between 20 and 22 or 23%. But as we see and we saw in the earlier statistics in the Peace Index from the Israel Democracy Institute, there's a goodly portion of the Arab population of Israel that is just happy with where they are. Doesn't mean that they're necessarily happy with all things that go on a daily basis. It probably means that they're frustrated to get some of the services that they want and need. But there has been an effort recently to pour a lot of money from the Israeli government into the Arab sector. But that doesn't mean that the minority in the state is satisfied. It does mean, however, that the majority in the state, the majority Jewish population, is taking into account the rights of the minority. And that is pretty significant in the Middle East for a country to worry about its minority and to actually put money into the minority's interests. Democratic values and Jewish values, it's been the debate now in the United States for a long, long time. Can Israel possibly continue to be democratic and control the Arab population of the West Bank and Gaza and the Golan Heights and East Jerusalem? It's an open-ended question. It's totally unfinished. I'm not going to come down one way or another as to whether it should or should not be. It's real, it's there, it's debatable, and I think it vexes a lot of people because what happens is a lot of people, particularly in the West, think that Israel has to come to a conclusion about retaining itself as a democracy and maintaining the Jewish value of not controlling a population that doesn't want to be controlled by it. And I think it's an imposition of the values which we have in the United States upon a reality that's in Israel. And the Israelis seem to be managing it. And maybe it's quite likely, as we read, that the Palestinians themselves don't particularly enjoy that unfinished nature of the relationship. And they would like it to be a bit different situation. Naturally, you can do something about it if you'd like to, is try and find the kind of leadership that can push in a direction of finding some common ground to reach an understanding so this issue doesn't vex American diaspora Jews more than it vexes Israelis. And I think, again, I go back to the early statistics which I showed, is that the Israelis have a different view, not necessarily a worse view, but they have a different view of how they see themselves and how they see themselves in the relationship to the Palestinian issue. It's just not the priority that's held here in the West. And I might say I'm an observer, a pretty keen observer of the Arab media. And I can say with a high degree of certitude that the Arab media in the last 2.5 or 3 months, or even more, 2.5 or 3 years, has taken an enormous public attitude of decrying the dislike of of the Palestinians for not taking control over their own destiny, and for not reaching out to finding a better way to govern themselves. Amazing kinds of criticism leveled by some of the most popular Arab writers. And it's notable. It doesn't mean that the Palestinians don't have a gripe or have an issue. It just means that others are not paying the attention that they once did, primarily because there's a little amount of normalcy on the borders. And more people are worried about the abnormal condition on Israel's borders today, which is certainly unfinished. If you take a look at the 50s and 60s, Israel's borders are a lot more stable than they are today. And so for Israel to have a normalized relation with its next door neighbors, it's pretty tough when you have situations going on like you go on in Lebanon or in Syria. And it's almost impossible to say that Israel's finished because of the inability to create secure and trustworthy relationships with its next door neighbors. It doesn't mean that Israelis don't try and wouldn't want to try and sometimes do try. It just means that the neighborhood doesn't make it conducive to the kind of agreement that you could ring out between a Begin and Sadat in 77 to 79 or 80, because the borders and the neighborhood was a lot more stable than it is today. And the diaspora connections. Diaspora connections are constantly under flux. They're constantly changing. I think that's for the good. I think it's terribly important for us to recall what Israel does to the diaspora in the positive sense. It may create a debate, contentiousness, and even cause some Jewish institutions to say, we're not going to talk about Israel because it's too sensitive. It raises ire. A rabbi said to me a year ago, August, I'm not talking about Israel from the Bima because if I go to the Oneg Shabbat, someone's going to accost me. Someone's going to say something to me, and I want to eat my herring. Well, it's a pretty interesting way of putting it. But I think the truth of the matter is that the diaspora relationship with the state of Israel has stiffened the diaspora's back. And it has made Jews stand up straighter. Anyone who grew up in the American South as Jewish would be able to stand up and say that immediately. And I've heard people stand in front of me and tell me stories on how that's the case. Where would American Jews be in terms of training children in Jewish institutions? Most Jewish institutions, or a lot of Jewish institutions. I haven't done survey research to know exactly. If we didn't have Israelis who've come to this country and stayed a while and ended up teaching Hebrew to our kids in day schools and congregational schools, how would we be getting our kids to the Bima and understanding the Hebrew language and using the Hebrew language? We don't have an overdose, an oversupply of Hebrew speakers who can take us, take our kids to where they have taken us. It's an amazing impact that Israel has had on American Jewry and diaspora Jewry in general. And you think about the number of diaspora Jews who are staffing day schools all over the world in foreign countries in Central and South America, for example. The unfinished reality also has had an impact on how the story is told. What is the narrative of Israel? How is it told? Is it told from the point of view of someone with a political bias? Is it told with someone who wants to tell the story by blending all sources together? And we're into this notion now of competing narratives or parallel narratives. It's an unfinished reality is the fact that the way Israel is taught, the way Israel is written, are all part of one small slice of Israel's reality, namely Israel and the Arab-Israeli conflict. Several years ago, I did a study, and the conclusion I came to was that something like 75 to 80% of the courses given in North American campuses where Israel is taught, aside from Hebrew language and lit, 75% Israel is taught in the context of the conflict, not in the context of Israeli society or anthropology or technology or Israel economics or history of Zionism. So the conflict has come to seep into the manner in which historiography is being written, history is being written, and therefore the historiography. And a whole new term, narratives, has jumped into the reality. And all I can do is suggest is that we hang on. We don't try and get too upset too quickly about Israel being unfinished. I think it's a state that's very much in a dynamic condition as it was in the pre-state period. It remains that way. I think you'd have to argue that immigration is no longer a contributor to the dynamic because the number of people who are actually going to Israel is much less than in earlier years. Most Jews around the world have pretty well settled into where they're going to live. So you have two major Jewish populations who are going to interact with one another for years to come. And I would offer to you a video. I'd offer you a video by Leon Whistletier. Whistletier in in March of 2013, he gave a talk at, I think, American University, Israel Studies and Jewish Studies in America. And I thought it was a first-rate look back at what Zionism has succeeded. And if you're going to want to continue to search and to read and to learn about it, I suggest you listen to the Whistletier YouTube because he answers a lot of questions about where Zionism succeeded and where it didn't. And I think some of the ones that he lists where there was not great success is it didn't solve the question of anti-Semitism. It didn't persuade all Jews to immigrate to Israel. It didn't normalize the Jewish people. And that's for certain. In addition, he goes on to argue Israel has not become independent of great powers. And the reason for that is, and I'll end with this, is that Israel, even though it's a majority Jewish state, and it's a majority state of Jews, it still is small, and it still must do what its founders did, is create relationships in order to sustain itself. Israel can't be an island unto itself because it's small. No matter how powerful its military and its economy may be, it must, by its very size and its very definition and its population, have to rely on relationships. And so Israel will have to play roles in the international community, in persuading people about the righteousness or justice of positions it takes, whether it be a prime minister coming to Congress in March of 2015 or giving a presentation, as he did less than 2 weeks ago, with reams of documents about why the Iranians are not telling the truth. Israel can't just sit back and, be like someone living in South Georgia and not really care very much about what goes on up in Canada or what goes on the West Coast. By its very definition, Israel will be engaged, and therefore Israel's story will remain unfinished. I would ask you, if you're interested, to take a good look at our website. Take a look at the way we've organized it according to themes and the documents we've put up there and the timeline. I think you'll find it an interesting way to stay abreast of contemporary readings that have to do with modern Israel. Thank you for your time. Have a good weekend.